Every empire that ever touched Egypt believed the same thing. They believed they had conquered it. The Persians believed it. The Greeks believed it. The Romans believed it. The Arabs, the Ottomans, the French, and the British all believed it too. Each one marched in. Each one took the throne. Each one carved their name into Egyptian stone. And every single one of them was wrong, because Egypt was never really conquered. Egypt absorbed its conquerors instead. That is the strange part of this story. Egypt has been invaded more times than almost any place on Earth. Its capital has fallen. Its pharaohs have been replaced by foreigners. Its language has been buried under new religions and new empires. And yet, 5,000 years later, Egypt is still Egypt. So how does a country survive that many invasions and still keep its identity? How does a strip of farmland surrounded by empty desert end up mattering to almost every empire in history? And why, even today, does a narrow waterway cut through Egyptian sand still shape how the entire global economy moves? To answer any of that, we need to start with a river. Egypt sits inside one of the harshest deserts on the planet. Sand stretches for hundreds of miles in every direction. There is almost no rain. Almost nothing grows. But through the middle of all that desert runs a single river, the Nile. Every year, the Nile flooded. It rose in summer, spilled across the land, and left behind a strip of black, fertile soil. Then it pulled back and waited for the next year. This flood was so reliable that ancient Egyptians built their entire calendar around it. Farmers didn't need to guess when to plant. The river told them, and that predictability changed everything. Because when farming becomes predictable, food becomes surplus. And when food becomes surplus, people stop worrying about survival. They start building instead. They build villages. Villages become towns. Towns need organization. Organization needs leaders. And leaders need a way to prove they are in charge. So around 3100 BC, a ruler known as Narmer did something no one nearby had done before. He unified the farming towns along the Nile into a single kingdom. One king, one river, one nation. This wasn't just political. It was something new for the ancient world. Most early societies were scattered clans, fighting over patches of land. Egypt became something different, a single connected state, stretching along a single lifeline of water. And this created its first major advantage, because Egypt wasn't spread across an open landscape like Mesopotamia. It was a narrow strip of farmland squeezed between two deserts. Those deserts weren't a weakness. They were a wall. To attack Egypt, an enemy had to cross hundreds of miles of open sand with no food and no water. Most armies simply couldn't do it. So while other early civilizations were being trampled by neighboring tribes, Egypt had centuries of relative peace to build. They built temples, they built writing systems, and they built the pyramids. The largest of them, the Great Pyramid of Giza, was constructed using over 2 million blocks of stone, some weighing as much as a small truck. There were no engines, there were no wheels strong enough for the job. Just ramps, ropes, wooden sleds, and tens of thousands of organized workers. For over 3,000 years, it stood as the tallest man-made structure on Earth. No one broke that record until the late 1800s. Think about that. A monument built before writing had even fully matured outlasted almost every empire that came after it. That alone should tell you something about how this story ends. And they built something else. Belief. The pharaoh wasn't just a king. He was described as a living god, the bridge between heaven and the Nile. This idea mattered more than it sounds, because a normal king can be defeated. A normal king can be replaced. But if the ruler is divine, then the entire system around him becomes sacred too. The temples, the priests, the rituals, the writing, the art, all of it becomes part of something eternal. And that idea would end up outliving nearly every army that tried to erase it. For centuries, this worked. Egypt grew rich. It grew powerful. It became the most advanced civilization in the ancient world. But every civilization eventually meets a challenge big enough to test it. For Egypt, that challenge arrived from the east. Around 1650 BC, a group called the Hyksos entered Egypt from Asia. They brought horses. They brought chariots. They brought weapons Egypt had never faced before. And they won. The Hyksos took the throne. Foreign kings now ruled the land of the pharaohs. For a while, it looked like Egyptian civilization had reached its end. This should have been the final chapter. A 500-year-old kingdom, broken by outsiders with better technology. But then something unexpected happened. Egyptian princes in the south studied the very weapons that had defeated them. They learned to build chariots. They learned new military tactics. And around 1550 BC, They turned around and drove the Hyksos out. Egypt didn't just recover. It came back stronger than before. This is the first time we see the real pattern of Egyptian history. Egypt gets knocked down. Egypt studies the enemy. Egypt absorbs what works. Egypt rises again, changed but still Egyptian. This period became known as the New Kingdom, and it was Egypt at its most powerful. Armies pushed into modern-day Syria. Temples grew larger. Pharaohs like Ramses II carved their victories into walls of stone that still stand today. But strength always attracts bigger threats. And the next threat came from the south. Around 730 BC, the kingdom of Kush, Egypt's neighbor along the Upper Nile, marched north and took the throne. For generations, Kush had watched Egypt. It had traded with Egypt. It had worshipped many of Egypt's own gods. Now its kings sat on the Egyptian throne themselves. This should have felt like a hostile takeover. Except the Kushite pharaohs didn't try to replace Egyptian culture. They restored it. They rebuilt crumbling temples. They revived old religious festivals. They even built new pyramids, echoing a tradition Egypt itself had abandoned centuries earlier. In some ways, the conquerors from the south preserved Egyptian tradition better than Egypt had preserved it for itself. But this new dynasty barely had time to settle in before an even larger power arrived. The Assyrian Empire, expanding out of Mesopotamia with iron weapons and a ruthless war machine, invaded in 671 BC. Egypt's armies could not hold them back. The Assyrians pushed deep into the Nile Valley and sacked its greatest cities. For a brief, brutal moment, Egypt was just another conquered territory inside someone else's empire. But the Assyrians were stretched thin, fighting wars on multiple fronts far from home. Local Egyptian rulers took advantage of the chaos, rebuilt their strength, and pushed the occupiers back out within a few short years. Egypt was independent again, bruised but intact. And the next threat came with an entire empire behind it. In 525 BC, the Persian Empire, the largest and most powerful empire the world had ever seen, invaded Egypt and won. For the first time, Egypt wasn't ruled by an Egyptian pharaoh at all. It was ruled from a palace thousands of miles away. This looked like the true ending, not a temporary occupation, but full absorption into someone else's empire. Except something strange happened again. The Persian kings, wanting to keep control of such a wealthy land, didn't try to erase Egyptian religion. They funded Egyptian temples. They wore pharaoh titles. They let Egyptian priests keep their power. In other words, to survive as rulers, they had to become Egyptian in the eyes of the people. That is the mechanism. Egypt didn't defeat every enemy. Egypt made its enemies pretend to be Egypt. And this pattern was about to repeat on an even larger scale. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great marched into Egypt. He took the country without a real fight. But Alexander did something interesting. He didn't tear down Egyptian religion. He walked into the desert to visit an Egyptian oracle. He let priests declare him the son of an Egyptian god. After his death, his general Ptolemy took control of Egypt and started a new dynasty. These were Greek rulers. They spoke Greek. They built a Greek-style city at Alexandria. But they also built temples to Egyptian gods. They took pharaoh titles. Their most famous ruler, Cleopatra, was the first in her family in nearly 300 years to actually learn the Egyptian language. Once again, foreign conquerors put on the mask of the pharaoh because ruling Egypt meant becoming part of its story. But Rome was watching, and Rome didn't play by the same rules. In 30 BC, after Cleopatra's defeat, Egypt fell to Rome. This time, Egypt wasn't a kingdom anymore. It became a Roman province, a source of grain to feed the empire's capital. Its temples slowly lost state funding. Its old writing system, hieroglyphics, began to fade. Christianity spread through the Nile Valley and reshaped religious life completely. For the first time, it looked like the ancient Egyptian identity might actually disappear. The gods stopped being worshipped. The temples closed. The language of the pharaohs eventually died out as an everyday tongue. Statues of the old gods were defaced. Some temples were converted into churches. Others were simply abandoned to the sand. By the 4th century, an imperial decree closed the remaining pagan temples across the empire, including the ones along the Nile. The last people who could still read hieroglyphics fluently were priests, and as the temples closed, those priests disappeared too. With them went the ability to read the very civilization that built the pyramids. If the story ended here, we would call this the true end of ancient Egypt. And in a way, it was. But here is the twist most people miss. Egypt itself did not disappear. Only one version of it did. Because in 641 AD, Arab armies swept into Egypt, bringing Islam and the Arabic language. And once again, Egypt didn't get erased. It transformed. Egyptians gradually adopted Arabic. They adopted Islam. Cairo grew into one of the greatest cities in the medieval world, a center of trade, scholarship, and religion. The old gods were gone. The old language was gone. But the pattern remained exactly the same. New rulers, new religion, new language, same river, same strategic position, same importance to anyone who wanted power in this part of the world. And because of that importance, empire after empire kept coming back for it. The Ottomans took Egypt in 1517, ruling it for nearly 3 centuries. Napoleon invaded in 1798, dragging Egypt into the middle of European power struggles. His campaign failed militarily within a few short years. French forces were eventually pushed out by British and Ottoman power. But Napoleon brought scholars along with his soldiers, and those scholars stumbled onto something extraordinary. A slab of black stone near the town of Rosetta, carved with the same message written 3 different ways. That single stone eventually let scholars crack a code no one had been able to read for over 1,000 years. Hieroglyphics, silent since the days of Rome, could suddenly speak again. A military failure had accidentally handed the world back the voice of ancient Egypt. Once again, a foreign defeat ended up preserving something Egyptian instead of erasing it. Then Britain arrived. By the late 1800s, Egypt had become deeply important again, this time not for its grain or its gold, but for a canal cut through its desert. The Suez Canal connected the Mediterranean directly to the Red Sea. Ships no longer needed to sail all the way around Africa to reach Asia. Suddenly, this narrow strip of desert became one of the most valuable pieces of geography on the entire planet. Britain didn't just want Egypt's history anymore. Britain wanted its location. So Britain occupied Egypt, controlling the canal that global trade increasingly depended on. For decades, Egypt was independent in name, but controlled by foreign interests in practice. It felt like history repeating in a new disguise. But then in 1956, Egypt did something almost no colonized nation had dared to do. It nationalized the Suez Canal, taking direct control of the very asset foreign powers had fought wars over. Britain, France, and Israel responded with a military invasion. And here is the strange part. Egypt lost the actual battle. But politically, the world sided against the invaders. International pressure forced them to withdraw. Egypt kept the canal. Once again, apparent defeat turned into strategic survival. But the newest threat to Egypt doesn't come from an army at all. It comes from upstream. The Nile doesn't begin in Egypt. It begins thousands of miles to the south, in the highlands of Ethiopia. And in recent years, Ethiopia has built a massive hydroelectric dam on the river's main tributary, one large enough to change how much water reaches Egyptian farmland downstream. For a country that has depended on this exact river for 5,000 years, that is not a small problem. It is existential. Negotiations have dragged on for over a decade. Threats have been made. So far, no shots have been fired. But the pattern underneath, it is exactly the same one we have seen again and again. A new power rises. Egypt's survival is threatened. And once more, Egypt has to adapt, negotiate, and find leverage instead of relying on strength alone. The tools have changed. Chariots became canals. Canals became dams. But the underlying story hasn't moved an inch. Egypt has never survived because it was unbeatable. It has survived because it always finds a way to remain necessary. So now we can return to the question we started with. Why does Egypt keep surviving, invasion after invasion, empire after empire, for 5,000 years? The real answer isn't that Egypt was too strong to be conquered. It was conquered constantly. The real answer is that Egypt occupies a location every major power eventually needs. A river that creates farmland in the middle of a desert. A land bridge between Africa and Asia. Later, a canal connecting 2 of the most important seas on Earth. You cannot ignore Egypt if you want to control trade between Europe, Asia, and Africa. You never could. So instead of destroying it, every empire that wanted to last had to become part of it. Persian kings took pharaoh titles. Greek kings built Egyptian temples. Arab caliphs rebuilt Cairo into a global center of learning. Even Britain, controlling from a distance, needed Egyptian cooperation to keep the canal running. At the beginning of this story, it looked like a mystery about survival. How did one country outlast Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Ottomans, French, and British invaders and still remain recognizably itself? The tempting answer is that Egypt was strong. unbreakable, impossible to erase. But that isn't quite true either. Egypt lost almost every major war on this list. Its capital fell more than once. Its language changed. Its religion changed twice. We thought this was a story about ancient monuments and lost pharaohs. It was actually a story about location. Egypt's true power was never really about pyramids or gold. It was about occupying a spot on the map that the rest of the world could never fully avoid. Today, roughly 12% of global trade still passes through the Suez Canal. Ships from China, oil from the Gulf, goods from Europe, all still squeeze through the same narrow strip of Egyptian water that made this land valuable thousands of years ago. The pharaohs are gone. The temples are quiet. The hieroglyphics are studied in museums instead of read in daily life. But the river is still there. And the location the river created is still exactly as important as it ever was. Every civilization that has tried to erase Egypt has ended up leaving a piece of itself behind instead, absorbed into a story that simply refuses to end. Go back to the beginning of this story. Every empire that touched Egypt believed it had conquered it. Now you know the truth. Egypt let them believe that. And in exchange, it survived inside every single one of them. A river civilization quietly rewriting whoever tried to rule it. Persian, Greek, Roman, Arab, Ottoman, French, British. Different flags, different languages, different gods. Same river, same soil, same story, still being written. And that is the real reason Egypt still matters. Not because it defeated history, because history could never afford to leave it behind.